The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in amber, casting everything in pale institutional white. Hannah Clarke moved through the ICU of Seattle General with the kind of invisibility that came from practice, head down, hands steady, eyes on the monitors and never on the faces of colleagues who suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere when she approached. 6 years of this. 6 years of keeping her head down in Savannah, volunteering for the worst shifts, the overnight doubles that broke other nurses' wills, while her left hand trembled slightly when she signed the medication charts. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked anything. That was the arrangement. The crash cart needed restocking. Bags of saline, extra syringes, the defibrillator pads checked and dated. Her hands moved through the ritual with precision that belonged to a different lifetime, muscle memory from concrete classrooms and desert heat and the kind of training the Pentagon had officially decided never happened. The rubber gloves snapped between her fingers like small gunshots in the quiet morning bay. She was counting the 14-gauge angiocath needles when the radio crackled. Incoming Marine Commander. Multiple GSW, shrapnel penetrating the thorax. Vitals are crashing. ETA 6 minutes. All trauma bays prepare for Level 1 activation. Hannah's hand stilled for exactly half a second. Then she resumed counting. 1 needle. 2. 3. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst settles over you like ash, and you learn not to react to anything anymore. 4. 5. Clarke. Dr. Mercer's voice cut across the ICU like a scalpel. He was already striding toward the trauma bay, his white coat fluttering behind him like the tail feathers of something predatory. You'll observe today. This case requires actual expertise. Trauma medicine isn't something you learn from watching war movies on the night shift. She didn't acknowledge him. That was safer. Mercer was the kind of physician who needed acknowledgement the way other men needed oxygen, constant, absolute, life-sustaining. If Hannah had learned anything in 6 years at Seattle General, it was that the best response to men like that was no response at all. She finished counting the needles, recorded the inventory in the logbook with deliberate care, and moved toward the trauma bay. The doors to the unit stood open, expectant. The commander arrived the way all critical traumas arrived, a controlled chaos orchestrated by paramedics who moved like dancers who'd practiced this exact steps 1,000 times. Stretcher. Monitor leads. Shouted vitals that painted a picture of a body being pulled under. BP 78 over 52 and dropping, O2 sat 89, respiratory rate 28, GCS 10, 2 large bore 4s running wide open. The stretcher locked into position at the trauma bay center. Overhead lights flooded down like stars concentrating their entire brightness into a single urgent space. Mercer positioned himself at the head of the bed, immediately beginning the rapid trauma assessment, calling out orders with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own competence. Around him, the team moved in synchronized efficiency, nursing staff cutting away the flight suit, exposing the body beneath, revealing the damage that shrapnel does to human tissue. Dark red blooming across the chest. Wounds that told stories about IED proximity, about being in the wrong place during the right mission, about the specific violence of Ramadi and places like it. And then she saw his face. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Not a tremor. Not a sound. Just the sudden, violent collision of 2 timelines intersecting in a single moment. The Marine commander's face was older now, 7 years older, the lines deeper, weathered by a deployment's worth of sun and stress and the particular exhaustion of command, but it was unmistakably him. The medic. The one who'd replaced her in Ramadi after the Pentagon had ordered her erased, classified, buried so deep that even the official records didn't acknowledge Captain Hannah Clarke had ever existed. This was the man who'd walked into her position with her equipment and her knowledge and her credibility, stepping into the vacancy she'd left behind when they'd pulled her out in the middle of the night and told her to disappear. He was the one who'd taken her life. And now he was dying in front of her. Move! Mercer snapped. Clarke, I said observe, not contaminate the field. Step back. Hannah stepped back. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Only the tremor in her left hand gave anything away, and she pressed that hand flat against her thigh and kept it there, hidden beneath the sterile field of her workspace. The trauma bay doors opened again. Family. A woman in her 50s, face ashen, fingers pressed against her mouth. Two teenage boys behind her, nearly identical, their shock so raw and immediate that it filled the room like a physical presence. And an older man, Vietnam veteran by the bearing of his shoulders and the way he scanned the room like he was assessing for threats, the father, probably, the grandfather, the weight of military service visible in the architecture of his spine. "Sir, you need to wait in the family area," one of the nurses said gently, moving toward them. "We'll keep you updated." "That's my son," the older man said. "That's my boy." The machines beeped their urgent language. The ventilator hissed. The 4 pumps clicked in mechanical rhythm. All the sounds of a body being held together by technology and will and the accumulated knowledge of 17 people who dedicated their lives to this exact moment. Hannah stood at the periphery of it all, her chart in her hands, her eyes on the monitors, her mind fracturing along fault lines she'd spent 6 years trying to keep sealed. Mercer called out the assessment with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own narrative. Penetrating chest trauma, approximately 20 centimeters from sternum, likely hemothorax, possibly cardiac involvement. We need a stat chest X-ray, CBC, CMP, coagulation panel, AN. Type and cross for 6 units, Hannah heard herself say. The words came out steady. Deferential. Suggesting, not commanding. Given the shrapnel pattern, he may have splenic or hepatic involvement. The velocity indicators suggest. I'll make the clinical decisions, thank you very much. Mercer didn't even look at her. Get the imaging. Now. She moved. That was her job. That was the arrangement. Keep your head down, do the work, never volunteer information, never suggest expertise, never let anyone know that the tremor in your left hand was muscle memory from a life the government had paid good money to make disappear. The portable X-ray machine rolled smoothly across the tile, the wheels barely whispering against the floor. She positioned it with the kind of precision that came from having done this before, in different hospitals, under different circumstances, with less fluorescence and more stars overhead. The image populated on the screen. Black and white. Anatomy rendered in grayscale. There it was. The hemothorax. The fluid compression that was already beginning to collapse the lung. The shrapnel scattered through the thoracic cavity like shrapnel, like violence rendered visible, like the consequences of being in the wrong place made manifest in bright white against the dark. The commander's eyes moved toward her. Just for a moment. Just a flicker of awareness, a connection, a question forming in a face that was slowly draining of color as his blood pressure continued its downward trajectory. His lips moved but no sound came out. The ventilator was breathing for him now, the tube down his throat stealing his voice, reducing him to monitors and numbers and the steady mechanical hiss of forced respiration. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. To him, she was just a nurse, one of the faces in the background of an emergency, rendered invisible by scrubs and anonymity and the particular way that trauma consumes all attention toward itself. He had no idea who was standing 3 feet away from him, watching him bleed, knowing exactly what he'd experienced because she'd walked the same streets in Ramadi, navigated the same IED-heavy zone, and carried the same scars, the visible ones and the ones nobody could quantify on an imaging study. Let's move him to the ICU, Mercer commanded. He needs sustained monitoring. We'll evaluate for surgical intervention based on how his vitals respond to aggressive fluid resuscitation and, Clarke, you're with me. The rest of you, get him upstairs. The stretcher rolled toward the doors. The family followed, that grandfather with the bearing of command trying to keep pace, the desperation in his movements barely contained behind the military training that taught you never to show weakness. The wife reached out toward the stretcher, her hand extended, unable to touch, unable to do anything but follow. Hannah moved with them. That was her role now. Trauma 1 to ICU. Monitor the numbers. Watch for deterioration. Keep the machines running and the tubes patent and the bleeding contained until someone decided what came next. She didn't let herself look at the commander's face again. She didn't let herself process the particular cruelty of the universe that would place this man under her care in this moment, in this city, after 7 years of trying not to think about him at all. The monitors continued their beeping. The fluorescent lights continued their buzzing. And deep inside her chest, beneath the sterile barrier of her scrubs and her anonymity and her 6 years of invisibility, something that had been locked down since Ramadi began to wake. The fluorescent lights continued their buzzing. And deep inside her chest, beneath the sterile barrier of her scrubs and her anonymity and her 6 years of invisibility, something that had been locked down since Ramadi began to wake. The commander's family crowded the trauma bay like a storm system compressing the air. His wife gripped the bedrail with both hands. 2 teenage sons stood frozen against the wall. An older man in a Vietnam veteran cap watched Hannah's assessment with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen battlefield triage before. Hannah assessed vitals with the precision of muscle memory, pulse, respirations, oxygen saturation, the subtle signs that live between the numbers on the monitor. She tracked his breathing pattern. Noticed the tracheal deviation. Registered the distended neck veins that shouldn't have been there. The pieces assembled in her mind like a tactical map. Possible pneumothorax. Possible tension pneumothorax. The kind that killed quietly if you weren't watching. Dr. Mercer stood at the foot of the bed reviewing the standard trauma protocol. He ordered a chest X-ray with the confidence of someone who'd memorized flowcharts but never had to improvise with a field pack and a battlefield doctrine. Dr. Mercer, I'd recommend immediate CT imaging for possible. Hannah kept her voice level. Clinical. Professional. He cut her off with a bark of laughter that made the family flinch like a gunshot had echoed through the room. Oh, here we go. Mercer's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty mixed with contempt. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Nurse Netflix. She thinks watching war movies makes her a trauma expert. Tell me, Clarke, did you get your medical degree from Call of Duty or was it Grey's Anatomy? The resident snickered. 2 of them. Young enough to not yet understand that mockery in front of families was a form of institutional violence that left no bruises. Hannah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. 1 muscle. 0.5 millimeter of tension. Her hands remained steady on the fall line. She continued her work without a word, her movements methodical and precise, each gesture a small assertion that she would not be diminished by his voice or his contempt or his need to establish dominance over a room full of scared people. Maybe if you spent less time pretending and more time learning your actual scope of practice, you'd understand why physicians make these decisions. Mercer gestured toward the door with the casual dismissal of someone removing an insect from his path. Stick to what you're qualified for, Clarke. The commander's wife looked at Hannah, then at Mercer, confusion crossing her face. Her husband was the one in crisis, but suddenly the room had split into 2 battlegrounds. Hannah's knuckles went white on the clipboard, but her face showed nothing. The veteran in the Vietnam cap stared at Mercer for 3 seconds without blinking. That kind of stare. The kind that held memory. Hannah completed the assessment in silence. Every vital sign documented. Every observation recorded in medical language so precise it could be read by anyone with training. The X-ray showed exactly what the standard protocol predicted. Nothing concerning to the untrained eye. Everything that mattered to someone who'd watched the same presentation kill soldiers in a trauma tent outside Ramadi. 2 hours later, the break room was empty except for Hannah. She sat at the table near the window with a sandwich she wasn't hungry for. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous anthem. She'd taken exactly 40 minutes for lunch because that was her allocation and she didn't abuse the system. Within seconds of her sitting down, 3 nurses suddenly remembered urgent tasks. One literally abandoned her coffee on the table mid-sip, the cup still steaming. Another muttered something about not getting involved as she hurried past. A third was suddenly essential to something happening in the medication bay. Hannah recognized the pattern. It was the same instinct that made prey animals scatter when a predator approached. Not malice. Not even conscious choice. Just survival. She ate alone in the empty room. Her stoic expression never wavered. Her shoulders never sagged. She didn't stare at her hands or replay Mercer's words or let anything crack at the surface. The sandwich tasted like cardboard and obligation. She finished it anyway because wasting food was another kind of failure, and she had already failed so many things that she couldn't afford to fail at this. By 1400 hours, the unit board in the main hallway displayed a new document. White paper with black lettering that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights like a neon sign of failure. Nurse Clarke, overstepping scope of practice, verbal warning. Dr. Mercer's signature was bold at the bottom, the letters so pressed into the paper they'd nearly torn through. She saw it the same moment everyone else did. Stopped in the hallway. Read the words. Felt the weight of being formally, publicly diminished. Her face remained neutral, but something behind her eyes darkened like storm clouds moving across water. Just for 1 second. Then the mask reset. Mercer walked past it 3 times that shift. Each time he glanced at Hannah with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction. A crack. A flinch. Some small acknowledgement that his words had landed. She never gave him one. She continued her work. Continued her assessments. Continued her documentation. Her composure became a kind of armor that was far more threatening than any outburst could have been. Over the next 12 hours, Mercer's strategy shifted. The mockery continued, but now it had structure. Intent. Calculation. He called the nursing director from his office at 1530 hours, door closed, his voice audible only to whoever sat behind that other desk. But Hannah saw the director's expression change when she passed in the hallway the next morning. Suddenly cold. Professional. Distant. The kind of distance that signaled paperwork and investigations and consequences. By evening, the 2 senior ICU nurses who'd worked with Hannah for 3 years, nurses who knew her competence the way soldiers knew which of their squad could be trusted, were reassigned to the cardiac unit for staffing needs. The charge nurse who might have vouched for Hannah's clinical judgment was moved to nights. A separation. Strategic. Clean. Mercer sat on the hospital's credentials committee. Most nurses didn't know this detail about him. But Hannah had learned early that understanding institutional power structures kept you alive. Power wasn't just what people could do directly. It was what they could arrange. What systems they controlled. What paperwork they could file. At 1900 hours, he sent an email to IT requesting temporary access restrictions for staff under review. By 2000 hours, Hannah's badge no longer opened the ICU doors. She had to be buzzed in by whoever worked the desk, a small humiliation that happened every time she came or went. 12 times on this shift. 12 small moments of dependency on someone else's consent to move through spaces she'd earned the right to occupy. The Marine commander's condition remained listed as stable, but Hannah noticed the details that lived outside the official assessment. His respiratory rate was climbing. 18 breaths. 20 breaths. His oxygen saturation was drifting downward despite supplemental O2 flowing at 6 liters. She documented everything in precise medical language, but her notes were buried in the chart where Mercer never looked. She approached the on-call resident at 2100 hours, a young doctor who'd always been friendly, who'd asked questions when she suggested interventions, who'd treated her like a colleague instead of an obstacle. She stood near him at the medication dispensary and spoke quietly, not wanting to create the impression of overstepping. The commander's respiratory status is trending downward. Monitor his O2 saturation closely. I'd recommend increased surveillance for signs of. She stopped. He was already looking away. Past her shoulder. Nervous energy radiating off him like heat off pavement. Dr. Mercer's the attending, and he said the patient's fine. I can't. I'm sorry, Hannah. He turned toward the patient rooms, dismissing her with his back. The words were kind, but the message was clear. Don't ask me to choose. Don't put me in a position where I have to risk my career for this. She nodded once and walked away, her limp more pronounced after 14 hours on her feet. The kind of limp that happened when everything hurt and you'd stop bothering to hide it. She returned to the break room. Drank water she didn't need. Stared at nothing. Calculated probabilities and outcomes and the precise moment when Mercer's clinical arrogance would intersect with the commander's declining physiology and create a crisis that would force decisions nobody wanted to face. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the flag. She felt it in her locker. Pressed against her sternum when she moved. The folded flag from Ramadi. The only physical proof she'd been there at all. The only object that connected her to the man lying in bed upstairs, dying quietly in increments no one else was watching for. She touched her sternum through her scrubs. One brief contact. Then dropped her hand and stood to return to the unit. She had 6 more hours on her shift. 6 more hours of watching and documenting and waiting for someone to finally see what she already knew. The waiting was its own kind of torture, but Hannah had learned years ago how to survive on patience. How to move through time the way soldiers moved through contested territory, one careful step at a time, trusting that eventually the landscape would reveal itself. The fluorescent lights continued their buzzing. And somewhere on the unit, a man who'd replaced her in Ramadi was breathing in a pattern that would change everything. At 01 for 5 hours, the alarm screamed through the wall like a warning that nobody should have ignored. Hannah was restocking the supply room, counting gauze, checking expiration dates, doing the work that kept her invisible, when the monitor tone cut through the fluorescent hum. High-pitched. Continuous. The kind of alarm that made her spine straighten before her brain caught up. She didn't hesitate. The bad leg that had ended her career moved fast when adrenaline took over, muscle memory older than her nursing license overriding the chronic ache that lived in her left thigh. The supply room door swung shut behind her. 7 steps to the elevator. 34 steps down the ICU corridor. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. The commander's room was chaos arranged as confusion. The night nurse, a floater from pediatrics, not trained for critical care, stood frozen beside the bed with one hand hovering over the call button as if touching it might make the situation worse. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 78% and falling like a stone through water. The patient's lips had turned the color of old bruises. His neck veins bulged against his skin like they were trying to escape, and his trachea had visibly shifted to the right, a telltale sign that said what Hannah's training had been designed to fix. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against the heart. Death was 2 minutes away if the pressure didn't release. 1 minute if he stopped breathing. She took in the room in the same way she'd scanned village streets in Ramadi: threat assessment, resources, exit vectors, time remaining. Page the on-call resident. Now, Hannah said. Her voice didn't ask. It commanded. The deferential tone she wore like a nurse's uniform, apologetic, uncertain, always seeking permission, had dropped away entirely. What came out was the voice of someone who'd given orders in a language that understood only authority. The pediatrics nurse actually jumped. She reached for the phone without arguing. That was the thing about competence: real competence didn't need to raise its voice. It just had to be unmistakable. Hannah moved to the crash cart. The equipment was organized by protocol, everything in its place, everything exactly where it should be for a nurse who knew what she was doing. She found the needle decompression kit without looking twice. 14-gauge angiocath. The kind of needle that had to go into the chest wall at exactly the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. A procedure that took 90 seconds in simulation and had to work faster than that in reality because anatomy didn't follow protocols when it was dying. She'd done this 17 times in Ramadi. 17 times under conditions that included mortar fire, inadequate light, and the knowledge that the screaming would stop when the air pressure released. The oxygen saturation climbed to 76. Then fell to 73. The commander's wife appeared in the doorway, her face the color of someone watching their life collapse in real time. 2 sons behind her, frozen in the way that civilians froze when medicine turned into survival. The on-call resident arrived in 3 minutes. 3 minutes too long. He was young. Hannah could see the tremor in his hands from across the room, the way his eyes couldn't focus on a single point, the particular quality of panic that came from being trained for something in theory and meeting it raw in the middle of the night. His name tag said Dr. Patterson. He looked like someone who'd read textbooks about crisis management but had never actually watched a man die despite everything trying to keep him alive. "Where's Dr. Mercer?" Patterson asked. His voice cracked on the name like it was a prayer to someone who could actually help. 20 minutes out, the night nurse answered. She was still holding the phone, as if the act of calling was the only thing keeping her functional. 70% now. The commander's skin had taken on a grayish tint, the specific color of oxygen deprivation, of cells starving in real time. Hannah could see the effort in his breathing, not the easy rise and fall of a healthy chest, but the desperate work of lungs fighting against pressure they couldn't overcome. His neck veins had stopped bulging. That was worse. That meant the pressure was building toward cardiac collapse, toward the moment when the heart simply stopped because it couldn't pump against the weight anymore. Patterson moved closer to the bed, then stopped. He looked at the patient. He looked at the crash cart. He looked at Hannah like she was someone who might have answers because she wasn't panicking, and that had to mean something. "I've never done a needle decompression outside of simulation," Patterson said quietly. It wasn't a confession. It was a surrender. "I've read the procedure. I know the anatomy. But I've never." He gestured at the monitor. "Not when it's actually happening." The oxygen saturation hit 68%. The alarm pitch climbed higher. The commander's wife made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and one of the sons moved forward as if he might be able to push the oxygen back into his father's lungs through sheer force of will. Machines screamed. People froze. The world narrowed to a single moment where everything depended on what happened in the next 90 seconds. Hannah's hand hovered over the crash cart. The needle was right there. She could see the sterile packaging, the gauge marked in clear numbers, the kind of tool that cost $500 and could be performed by someone with the right training for free. She'd been marked in writing as overstepping her scope of practice. She'd been restricted from the ICU after this shift ended. She'd been systematically erased by a man whose only threat was that she knew how to do things he could only theorize about. If she acted now, she'd give Mercer exactly what he needed to end her career. If she didn't act, she'd watch a man die. Worse, she'd watch him die knowing that she could have stopped it. That she'd stopped it before, 17 times, in places where the stakes were measured in lives per minute and nobody questioned whether you had the right to save them. "What do I do?" Patterson asked. He was looking directly at her now, not at the monitor, not at the patient, not at the equipment. Just at Hannah. His eyes held the particular desperation of someone standing at a line he couldn't cross alone. The oxygen saturation fell to 65. There were protocols about scope of practice. There were regulations about chain of command. There were official procedures written in hospital policy that said registered nurses could prepare equipment but only licensed physicians could perform invasive procedures. Those protocols had been written by people who'd never watched someone die when they had the tools to prevent it. Those regulations had been designed by people who'd never been in a room where the choice was between breaking a rule and breaking a human being. The military had different protocols. In the Marines, in the chaos of Ramadi, the protocol was simple: whoever had the training and the proximity moved. Whoever could act, acted. The formalities came later, if there was a later. If the person survived to file paperwork about it. Hannah reached for the needle. She didn't look at Patterson or the night nurse or the family frozen in the doorway. She didn't think about Mercer or the write-up or the suspension that was coming. She thought about the streets of Ramadi and the medic who'd taken her place there, who'd done the work she'd been trained to do, who'd carried on when she was erased. She thought about the same IED-heavy streets that had trained him in the particular kind of medicine that didn't wait for permission. The needle came free from the crash cart with the soft whisper of packaging tearing. The oxygen monitor showed 61%. The commander's eyelids were starting to flutter in the way that meant consciousness was sliding toward darkness. His wife was saying something. Hannah couldn't hear words anymore, just the sound of terror shaped like a voice. She moved toward the bed with the kind of precision that only came from muscle memory older than doubt. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle angled at 45 degrees. Everything she'd learned in training, everything she'd practiced in Ramadi, everything that lived in her hands now, waiting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that in 60 seconds, whether this worked or failed, her life as it had been constructed would be over. Mercer would have his ammunition. The suspension would become permanent. The carefully built identity of just another nurse, competent but unremarkable, would shatter the moment that needle went into the patient's chest. 30 years of staying quiet. 30 years of being invisible. All of it dissolving in the space between one breath and the next. The alarm screamed. The monitor showed 58%. The room held its breath like it was a living thing. And Hannah Clarke, Captain Hannah Clarke, who'd given orders in Ramadi, who'd held dying men together with her hands, who'd been erased from history because she'd been too good at saving lives in places where women weren't supposed to be brave, stepped forward into the only choice she'd ever really had. Her hands moved before her mind finished deciding. The 14-gauge needle gleamed under the trauma bay lights. Hannah's fingers found the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this in darkness, in sand, in the chaos of Ramadi where hesitation meant body bags. She swabbed the site with surgical precision. Chlorhexidine stung the air, that sharp medicinal bite she knew by heart. The needle went in smooth. No resistance. No doubt. The hiss came next. Air rushing out like a pressure release valve finally opening. The sound of a lung re-inflating. The commander gasped, his body convulsing as oxygen flooded back into spaces that had been collapsing, suffocating him from the inside. His color changed. Lips went from dusky purple to pink in seconds. The monitor's oxygen saturation began climbing, 74%. 82%. 89%. 95%. Stable. The on-call resident stood frozen 3 feet away, his hand still hovering over the crash cart he'd never reached. His mouth hung open. His eyes tracked from the commander's improving vitals to Hannah's face, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. A nurse. Not even a resident. Just a woman in scrubs who'd moved like someone operating from a blueprint written into her bones. "How did you," he started, his voice thin and disoriented. Hannah was already documenting. Her pen moved across the chart in steady, precise strokes. Procedure. Time. Her signature. No expression on her face. No tremor in her hands. The mask was perfect. Absolute. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Mercer arrived at 0213 hours. He stood in the doorway of the trauma bay for exactly 5 seconds, scanning the monitor, reading the chart, seeing the notation of a needle decompression performed by nursing staff. His face went the color of old bruises, purple bleeding into red. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice came out quiet. "Dangerous." The resident's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Hannah. Mercer didn't wait for an answer. "Clarke. My office. Now." The walk down the hallway felt like moving through water. Hannah kept her breathing steady. Kept her face blank. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps trapped in plastic. Her badge felt heavier against her chest than it ever had, a countdown timer she could feel ticking. Mercer's office was small, airless, lined with plaques and diplomas that spoke of a man obsessed with credentials. He didn't sit down. Neither did Hannah. He stood behind his desk like it was a shield, his hands flat on the surface, leaning forward with the intensity of someone finally allowing himself to stop pretending. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization," he said, enunciating each word like he was speaking to someone slow. "That violates scope of practice. That violates hospital policy. That violates the chain of command." Hannah said nothing. "You put that patient at risk. You put this hospital at risk. You put me at risk." His voice had dropped lower, which was worse somehow. More calculated. I have been documenting your behavior since you arrived on this unit. Every assumption you've made. Every look you've given me. Every time you thought you knew better than the physicians in charge. The patient was in respiratory failure, Hannah said quietly. Tension pneumothorax. He would have coded within minutes. I don't care if he would have sprouted wings and flown out the window, Mercer snapped. You don't get to decide protocol. You don't get to decide when to break rules. You're a nurse. Act like one. The words landed like shrapnel, but Hannah's face remained calm, still as a held breath. The mask didn't slip. It never did. By 0600 hours, when the morning shift arrived, Mercer had already made his calls. He'd been building this architecture carefully, every piece positioned, every connection reinforced. He called the hospital administrator at home. Left a message marked urgent. Then the nursing director. Then the chief of medicine. Each conversation the same: unauthorized procedure, scope of practice violation, patient safety concerns, need for immediate suspension pending investigation. He presented his documentation like evidence at trial. The write-up from 3 days ago. The scope of practice complaint he'd filed. Now this, a procedure performed by a nurse without physician consultation, without proper authorization, without any business being performed by someone whose credentials didn't extend beyond taking vital signs. What twisted the knife was his precision. Mercer wasn't yelling. Wasn't making wild accusations. He was presenting facts, or what looked like facts if you didn't understand the context. And he positioned himself on the hospital's credentials committee, a strategic move made 6 months ago that now granted him the authority to alter badge permissions, to change access levels, to isolate her from the very systems that would have protected her. At 0800 hours, Hannah received her formal suspension notice. 24-hour turnaround. The letterhead was crisp. The language was clinical. Pending investigation. Effective immediately. Her badge would be reprogrammed. Her access to the intensive care unit and all restricted areas would be revoked. She was to remove her belongings and leave the premises by noon. The phone call came at 1047 hours. This is Seattle General Security. We need you to come retrieve your personal items from your locker. You're welcome to bring a witness if you'd like. Hannah hung up without responding. At 1147 hours, 2 security officers escorted her through the hospital lobby. She kept her spine straight. Kept her eyes forward. The staff who'd worked beside her for 6 years suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. One nurse she'd trained to start difficult falls on septic patients turned and walked into a supply closet rather than make eye contact. A respiratory therapist she'd mentored looked away. Even the janitor who always smiled at her found his mop suddenly fascinating. The silence was a living thing. The kind of silence that comes when someone's reputation has been professionally assassinated, when whispers are already spreading through shift reports and break room conversations. The suspended nurse. The one who overstepped. The one who thought she was smarter than the doctors. She walked past the nurse's station where her personnel file had hung just that morning. Past the ICU where she'd spent 6 years of 12-hour shifts rebuilding herself from someone broken into someone solid. Past the elevator where she'd ridden up with the commander 3 days ago, before he'd looked at her like she was a ghost he recognized. The parking lot was bright with afternoon sun. The heat off the asphalt shimmered like a living thing. She sat in her car for 7 minutes before she started the engine. 7 minutes of staring at nothing, at everything, at the weight of making the choice to save someone when saving him cost her everything. The drive home took 19 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock. She needed to know exactly how long she'd been falling. Her 11-year-old daughter Emma was homesick from school, some stomach bug that had been going around. She was watching television when Hannah walked through the door, still in her scrubs because she hadn't thought to change. Emma's head turned. Her eyes went wide with the awareness that something was fundamentally wrong. "Mommy? Why are you home?" Hannah meant to answer. Meant to smile and say something reassuring and normal. But the words didn't come. They got stuck somewhere between her lungs and her throat, choking her. She walked to the kitchen table and sat down. Just sat there in her scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and failure, her hands folded flat on the surface like they belonged to someone else. The mask cracked. It happened quietly, without drama. No trembling. No gasping sounds. Just tears that came steady and silent, the way they'd learned to come in Ramadi when you couldn't afford to actually break, when you had to stay functional and small and invisible. Tears that knew how to be quiet. Emma found her 2 hours later. She came into the kitchen for water and stopped when she saw her mother sitting in the same position, the folded flag from her locker now in front of her on the table. That flag. The one Hannah had never explained. The one with a name embroidered on the corner in thread that had faded nearly to white. A Marine's name. A Marine who wouldn't be coming home. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Emma's voice cracked with terror. 8-year-old terror. The terror of a child who'd learned that sometimes the person you need to protect you can't protect themselves. Hannah couldn't explain it. Couldn't say that she'd given everything again. Couldn't tell this child that saying a life had cost her the only identity she'd been allowed to keep. Couldn't explain that the Pentagon had erased her once, and now a man with a degree on his wall and a voice like poison had erased her again. She just pulled her daughter close and held her, and both of them cried over a folded flag that represented everything Captain Hannah Clarke had lost twice over. Neither of them heard the phone ringing in the other room. The call that was already in motion. The one that would change everything. Security walked her out at noon. Hannah didn't resist. She'd expected this, calculated, inevitable, the final move in a game she'd already lost the moment Mercer decided her competence was a threat. The badge was deactivated before she reached the lobby. She felt it when she swiped at the elevator, that soft red blink, denial, the electronic equivalent of a door slamming. Nobody looked at her as she passed. That was the hardest part. Not the walk itself, but the way the hospital seemed to absorb her departure, to close the gap she'd left like a body of water settling after a stone had been thrown. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause for her exit. She sat in her car for 12 minutes before she could move, hand steady on the steering wheel, breathing as she'd been trained, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The radio crackled with hospital chatter, a life she was no longer part of. She turned it off. The silence felt worse. 2 hours later, her daughter Emma found her at the kitchen table. Hannah hadn't moved. The folded flag lay before her, the one piece of proof that Ramadi had been real, that the girl she'd been before the Pentagon erased her had actually existed. The fabric was faded now, the creases permanent from 6 years of being the only thing Hannah trusted to stay true. She'd told Emma it was just something old, something Mommy kept safe. She'd never told her what it meant. When Hannah saw her daughter standing in the doorway, saw the confusion flicker across her face, why was Mommy home at this hour, why was she sitting so still, why were there tears, Hannah's composure finally fractured. Not in the way other people broke. This was something older, something that had been held together with pure will for so long that the strings finally snapped. The tears came without sound, without the drama of sobs, just the simple gravity of a body finally releasing what it had been carrying. Emma didn't ask questions. She sat beside her mother and put her small hand on the flag, and Hannah let her, because there were no words for what this meant. The hospital continued without her. The commander recovered in his ICU bed, unaware that the nurse who'd saved him was no longer in the building. Dr. Mercer received his suspension notice by email, along with a mandate to preserve all documentation related to his patient care decisions. He smiled to himself. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd protected patient safety. She'd violated protocol. The investigation would clear him. It always did. But that wasn't the worst part. At hour 6 of the suspension, when Hannah was still at her kitchen table, still holding the weight of erasure, a gunshot victim arrived at Seattle General's Trauma Bay. 28 years old, abdominal wound, bleeding out. The trauma team mobilized. The OR prepped. The intake nurse scanned his ID and went pale. Name, Khalil Hassan. Documentation, resettled refugee, NATO interpreter. The notes in his file said something else, brother to a Ramadi resident named Farah Hassan, who'd been treated by a field medic in 2017 against all protocol, saved from sepsis by someone who didn't follow the rules, who chose to help instead of report. He was wheeled through the hallway where Hannah had been escorted out just hours before. And he was conscious. Conscious enough to hear the code being called. Conscious enough to ask if the trauma nurse was there, the one who'd come with the Marines, the one with the steady hands. A doctor told him to stop talking, to preserve his energy. But Khalil Hassan knew trauma. He'd seen it from the other side of a rifle. He knew what it looked like when someone kept you breathing because they couldn't live with the alternative. When they passed the ICU, he saw him. The commander. Still in his bed, still fighting back to strength. And Khalil asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "Is she here? Is Widow 6 still here?" The commander's head turned. That nickname. Nobody in Seattle General knew that nickname. But the commander recognized it instantly. Widow 6. That was what his unit had called her in Ramadi, the woman they'd sent to replace Hannah Clarke after she'd disappeared, the one they'd whispered about because everyone knew something had been buried, some record expunged, some name removed from history like a person erased from a photograph. He demanded the nurses bring him his personnel file. It took 17 minutes. When they did, he read it aloud, his voice steady and clear, made for commanding rooms, Captain Hannah Clarke. Silver Star for Valor. He paused. Let that sink in. The silence spread. Bronze Star with V device for Valor under fire. Another pause. Then, like a final judgment, 2 purple hearts. Dr. Mercer heard the words from the hallway. He was there, ostensibly checking on another patient, but really surveying his domain one last time before the investigation began. His face changed. Some instinct told him what was happening. He burst into the ICU ward, his voice pitched at maximum authority. That nurse is suspended. She has no business being near patients. This ends now. But the commander was already looking past him. The door to the unit had opened, and a woman in dress blue stood in the frame, straight-backed, moving like someone who'd walked through worse than any hallway. General Patricia Knowles, 2 stars on her shoulder, stationed at nearby Fort Stewart. She'd been visiting her wounded Marines when she overheard the personnel file being read. She'd heard the name. She'd understood immediately. She walked toward Hannah's personnel file, still in the commander's hands, and looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Mercer. Then she rendered a crisp, formal salute to the decorations listed on the page, a gesture that turned the entire unit silent, the kind of silence where you can hear the ventilators breathing for people who can't breathe for themselves. Mercer's face went the color of old bone. He opened his mouth. Closed it. He tried to move toward her, but something in that salute had fundamentally shifted the geometry of power in the room. A visitor, a man with a phone recording everything, was standing in the corner, his camera steady, capturing Mercer's snarl, his attempt to dismiss it all. She's a liar. A lying suspended nurse who violated protocol. The video uploaded within 4 minutes. By midnight, it had 1.2 million views. By morning, 4 million. The hospital's switchboard jammed with calls. News outlets picked it up by 9 a.m. Doctor humiliates decorated veteran nurse. The footage was clinical and damning, you could see everything. Mercer's cruelty distilled into 30 seconds of video. The general's salute. The refugee translator's whispered recognition. The commander's dignity in reading decorations no one had told the hospital he actually possessed. Mercer sat in the administrator's office by 10 o'clock, trying to spin it. She violated protocol. She's under suspension. I was protecting patient safety. His voice sounded thin to his own ears. The administrator's phone rang. She answered, went pale, and put it on speaker. This is Dr. Richard Holloway. I'm calling from Johns Hopkins. Mercer's hand stopped moving. His mentor. The man who'd written his recommendation letters, supervised his residency, shaped everything he'd become. I just watched the video of my former student. I'm releasing a public statement within the hour disowning Dr. Mercer's actions and personally requesting a full board review of his conduct. The line went dead. The administrator looked at him. Leave your badge. By noon, the Pentagon's line was ringing. A 3-star general demanded information about Captain Clarke. The classified operation she'd been erased from remained sealed, but her decorations were real, her service was real, and someone had broken protocol by denying her existence. The paperwork began. The machine that had buried her once was forced to acknowledge her now. By hour 72, the hospital board convened an emergency session. Dr. Holloway's statement was brutally precise. I trained this man to heal, not to abuse those who've served with honor. 3 patients filed complaints about Mercer's treatment. 7 nurses came forward with stories they'd been too afraid to tell. The commander's wife gave an interview. That nurse saved my husband's life while that doctor filled out paperwork to fire her. Mercer's medical license went under state review. His colleagues stopped returning calls. The strategic reputation he'd built over years dissolved in hours like something that was never actually solid. 6 months later, Hannah Clarke walked into the VA trauma unit under her real name. Captain Hannah Clarke, USMC, Ret. The Pentagon had finally acknowledged her after the video forced their hand, though the classified operation remained buried. Her office was small and hers. On the wall hung 2 folded flags in display cases, the one from Ramadi and the one the commander had given her, presented by a Marine Corps that finally knew Widow 6 had come home. Dr. Mercer taught CPR fundamentals at Coastal Community College for $15 an hour. His medical license was restricted to non-clinical education only. The board review had found a pattern of abuse spanning years, buried under a carefully maintained reputation. The refugee translator survived. He visited her at the VA, bringing his brother, the insurgent she treated in Ramadi, because her oath said heal, not judge. Emma understood now why her mom had cried that day, and why she didn't anymore. Some burdens, once shared, become lighter. Some flags, once displayed, finally tell their story. Some nurses, once seen, can never be unseen. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, erased, or forced to hide who you actually are, like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? We'll be back next week with more stories of people who refuse to stay invisible. Thank you for watching.